Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ultimate History of the 80s Teen Movie. Fast Times at Ridgemont High, 16 Candles, Revenge of the Nerds, The Karate Kid, The Breakfast Club, Dead Poets Society, and everything in between. By James King. Read by Mike Cooper. Introduction. Only one thing bothered him, and that was the passing of time. Already he was 18, almost 18 and a half. Soon enough he would be 19, 20. Then this golden age would pass. By natural law, someone new would arise to replace him. Then everything would be over. Nick Cohn, Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night. We all know what a teen movie is. High school or college-age characters, youthful issues, maybe a prominent pop soundtrack, definitely an adolescent target audience. But those are just the facts, the boxes to be ticked. What else do they have? What is it that has kept young theatre-goers going to see teen films throughout Hollywood's history and keeps them returning, even as adults? Time certainly plays a part. Whether your teen movie centres on a Saturday detention, an era-hopping DeLorean car, or desperate attempts to get laid, it's questions of time that unify the genre and perhaps provide the real pull. Life is short, they all say. Adolescence even shorter. So make the most of these few teenage years, this magic time. One day it will all be over. The 1980s proved especially fertile ground for such alluring stories. Filmmakers who flourished in the previous decade, themselves once known as young movie brats, were now hitting middle age, with many facing both personal and professional crises. A new, more focused Hollywood emerged to counter their expensive indulgences, and the teen audience that had flocked to see Jaws and Star Wars, streamlined yarns in which the selling point was the concept rather than brooding method acting or an award-winning cast, were ruthlessly targeted. And of course, even on the business side, timing was everything. Young writers and directors who came of age during the 60s now found their poignantly autobiographical teen stories encouraged, often by studio executives of a similar age and taste. Meanwhile, relaxed moral codes let them get away with cheekier rock and roll honesty than Gidget could ever have dreamed of. If many young actors actually just wanted to be taken seriously and were hardly eager to be part of anything deemed a new scene, then at least they could take comfort in the fact that if you were a teenager, or even just looked like one, suddenly work was plentiful. 1978's triple teen whammy of Saturday Night Fever, Grease, and Animal House had shown Hollywood exactly where it was heading, and it didn't hold back on following up with new youth-centered product. Oversaturation was inevitable. Surprise successes from the first half of the 80s morphed into more calculated cash-ins, where the presence of a newly emerged star, popular fad, or currently fashionable song on the soundtrack often outweighed emotional depth. The emergence of home video as a force to be reckoned with certainly contributed to quantity over quality, and some of Hollywood's hottest teen actors and super producers struggled to use their popularity wisely. In a time of heightened consumerism, championed by a right-wing president, maybe it was impossible not to. And then there was the problem of growing up. It happens to everyone, as so many teen movies like to lament, but in a youth-obsessed industry, actors maturing in public is no easy task. So if teen films remind us of our brief adolescence, then they remind many of their stars of something else too, their own moment as the nation's favourite pin-up. Eventful, but brief. Happily, though, authenticity nearly always won through, marking the difference between, say, Heathers, still talked about today, and Hot Dog the movie, thankfully forgotten. And it was authenticity that would be the natural buzzword come the beginning of the next decade, the packaging of the previous 10 years now starting to look too slick and just too damn white for the 1990s. It was time for teen tastes to go full circle, allowing a grungier, more independent approach that owed much to the 70s to once again find the spotlight. But the best of the 80s teen movies never entirely went away, forever frozen in time on TV, DVD, and download. Their stories might deal with a fleeting period, a day off, a school year, a special summer, but their charm, it seems, is ageless. It's not, however, an agelessness filled only with sweetness and light. In 2018, the year when the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and assault became a global phenomenon, a handful of teen films from over 30 years earlier suddenly found themselves at the top of news agendas and discussed in the same breath as high-profile allegations against men as varied as Harvey Weinstein, Louis C.K. and Donald Trump. Initially, this was the result of an article in The New Yorker written by former teen queen Molly Ringwald, in which she expressed her unhappiness with several glaringly inappropriate sexual jokes in the now iconic batch of films she made with writer-director John Hughes. An implied date rape in the 1984 film 16 Candles drew most of her attention, and she reiterated important points about sexism, racism and voyeurism in his films that had been circulating for a while, and with which no balanced moviegoer could argue. But the fact that it was Molly Ringwald saying them, perhaps the most cherished high school movie star of the decade, made the discomfort all the more pertinent, not to mention newsworthy. Later in the year, Ringwald's words were echoed in the countless think pieces surrounding the controversial nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court. Kavanaugh had been accused by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford of a sexual assault that dated back to their time in high school in 1982, and during the media circus of his testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, he cited riotous, teen-oriented films of the era such as Animal House and Caddyshack as part of his defense. If his old yearbook profile made him look like a sexual deviant, it was just the editors pranking and joking in the mould of a Bluto or Spackler, he claimed. Whether you buy such an excuse or not, it's hard to disagree that some of the frat boy comedy in films such as Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, and a whole host of contemporaneous sex comedies has dated badly, dangerously celebrating a dumb behaviour that shouldn't have even been around in the 1980s, let alone today. And yes, it's even there in some John Hughes movies. Yet many key films in the history of Hollywood feature elements which now make contemporary audiences cringe. The portrayal of Native Americans in many old westerns, the role of women in early James Bond, Mickey Rooney's Japanese grotesque in Breakfast at Tiffany's. That shouldn't, however, stop us appreciating the parts that do work. The John Hughes movies in particular are full of a rare wisdom and insight, not to mention dynamic female characters, that makes their occasional foray into questionable territory all the more disappointing. Perhaps our discussions around them are now more critical than before, and of course we have to acknowledge those mistakes of the past, but we can still give credit where it's due. And thus, the 80s teen movie continues to get audiences talking, nearly 4 decades after its inception. For good and bad, the genre's impact rumbles on. This is its story, and it begins 2 years before the turn of the decade on a brightly coloured dance floor somewhere in Brooklyn. 1. Travolta's 78. Saturday Night Fever and Grease rule the box office. Hollywood falls back in love with teenagers, and the movie brats struggle with the imminent new decade. John Travolta was Hollywood's last great star of the 70s. 1978 was his year. Saturday Night Fever, released the previous Christmas, topped the US box office until Valentine's Day, still filling screens come early April when the actor attended the 50th Academy Awards in Los Angeles. His performance as Fever's Tony Manero up against heavyweight turns from Richard Burton and Marcello Mastroianni for Best Actor. He was just 24 years old, the category's 3rd youngest nominee ever. Richard Dreyfuss took home the Oscar that night for his role as neurotic actor Elliot in Neil Simon's The Goodbye Girl. But Saturday Night Fever mania wasn't about to go away. Its soundtrack album was still #1, would be for another 3 months, on its way to shifting 15 million in the States and ruling charts around the globe. John Travolta, it seemed, had the whole world at his disco dancing feet. Really, though, that was only the start. With barely a pause for breath, Travolta was back on the big screen by the summer, this time in Greece, and between June and October there was only 1 week when the 50s set musical wasn't the most popular movie in America. Its soundtrack, meanwhile, knocked the Rolling Stones from the summit of Billboard's Top 200 to eventually claim the year's 2nd biggest sales figures, behind only Saturday Night Fever. In just a few months, Travolta had risen from small-screen favourite to the biggest showbiz pin-up on the planet. A one-man film, music and fashion industry, his turbo boost in popularity up there with Elvis post-signing to RCA in '56, or the Beatles after debuting on The Ed Sullivan Show. And it all made sense. John Travolta was irresistible, a mix of macho bravado and boyish vulnerability, his masses of dark wavy hair framing a face that could barely contain the lethal combination of sky-blue eyes, sunny grin, and the most famous chin dimple since Kirk Douglas. Yet, in just those two movies, films made back-to-back, on screens within moments of one another that fateful year, one phase of Hollywood history was ending, another just starting up. Here was a changeover period in Hollywood so significant that Travolta, the megastar conduit, would struggle for years with the impact. John had been born to Salvatore and Helen, a tire salesman and a former actress, in Englewood, New Jersey, on February 18th, 1954, the last of 6 children. Maybe if he'd been a bit older, his rise and fall wouldn't have been so great. A bit younger, on the other hand, and a new age and new decade of teen roles would have surely opened up to him. Yet by the end of 1978, and with his 25th birthday fast approaching, John Travolta found himself at the top of a pile, yet with nowhere to go. Yes, he was Hollywood's last great star of the 70s, perhaps the decade's most sparkling. But he was also the 80s' first victim. In the early part of the 1970s, it had been Travolta's fellow Italian-American New Yorkers, Robert De Niro, 11 years his senior, and Al Pacino, 14, who had hogged the headlines, turning film acting asunder by redefining what it meant to be a leading man. Working within the so-called New Hollywood, that group of independent, determinedly cinephile writer-directors such as Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese and Sidney Lumet, on projects with complex and damaged heroes, The Godfather, Mean Streets, Serpico, suddenly critical acclaim was no longer just about traditional epics boasting glamorous stars. Now that Vietnam, Watergate, and social unrest filled the news bulletins, even the frequently frothy movie industry refocused on the personal and the flawed. The directors might have been nicknamed movie brats, a nod to their precociousness, but it was a label that belittled their achievements. Things had gotten impressively intense. De Niro was raising the bar for all of us young actors, Travolta later remembered, and that means if you were going to play a role, you had to really learn how to do the thing you were doing. If you wanted to box, you had to become a real boxer. If you were going to play a saxophone, you had to spend a year learning how to play a saxophone. The young John could only look on, close, but not close enough. In the summer of '75, with low-budget horror The Devil's Reign recently wrapped, his persistence finally paid off. Welcome Back, Kotter, a new ABC sitcom about a pupil returning to his old high school to teach, not only gave John an audition, but also the winning break he'd been craving, casting him as rebellious student Vinnie Barbarino. Within a few weeks, he was getting 10,000 fan letters a week, and scripts were feverishly rewritten to give the new heartthrob more screen time. Born too late? It hardly seemed so. Yet Travolta, mid-decade and no longer a teenager, didn't just want to be a pretty boy, releasing cash-in pop records to lovelorn adolescent fans. It didn't matter that success in Kotter led to him having a hit single, 1976's Let Her In. It didn't matter that ABC then cast him as the lead in top-rated TV movie The Boy in the Plastic Bubble. It didn't even matter that Brian De Palma's acclaimed operatic teen horror Carrie hit theatres the same week as Bubble, with John in a supporting role as school bully Billy Nolan. That actors might kill for that much work wasn't the point. When John's heavy Kotter filming schedule reportedly meant he had to turn down the lead in auteur Terrence Malick's brooding Texan period piece, Days of Heaven, it was frustrating, pure and simple. The wannabe De Niro desperately wanted a real shot at grown-up filmmaking. Then, for a brief moment, the stars aligned. Two sometime business partners, both vastly experienced, both masters of hype, and both part of the so-called Velvet Mafia, The gay glitterati, whose interests spanned multiple aspects of American show business in the early 70s, got John on their radar. Alan Carr was the flamboyant one, a kaftan-clad Broadway producer and talent agent who thought fast, talked fast, made decisions instantly. Robert Stigwood was quieter, yet arguably more ruthless, a toothy, wavy-haired Australian impresario who looked like an older brother to the Bee Gees boys he managed. Stigwood had played a key role in reshaping the British pop scene of the 60s as a fearlessly independent manager, agent and producer. Now he was expanding into American theatre and film. Carr's client list included the Fabulous, Betty Davis and Playboy. Stigwood's boasted the Serious, supergroup Cream and the EMI Corporation. But ever the showmen, both liked to party. B.G. Barry Gibb summed it up. If there's reincarnation, Robert will come back as Louis XVI. Carr and Stigwood clicked. They'd first worked together on Ken Russell's movie of The Who's Tommy in '75, Stigwood producing, Carr across marketing and promotion. A surprisingly successful redub of a Mexican exploitation flick called Survive had followed, generating good dollars for both of them and for distributor Paramount. They'd been aware of the young Travolta's charisma for some time. Carr first meeting him at a recording studio during the teen pop era, Stigwood from that Jesus Christ Superstar audition years earlier. The stage musical was one of his productions. Now Carr had a pet project that was crying out for John as lead. A movie version of the show in which the actor had once toured, Grease. Stigwood, meanwhile, had just bought the film rights to journalist Nick Cohn's article on Brooklyn clubbers called Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night, a piece that had first appeared in New York magazine a couple of years earlier. He was also desperate for Travolta to top line. Since Grease was still running in Theatreland, Carr's movie adaptation of the show was obliged to hold off for another year, allowing Stigwood to get going with his idea first, now renamed Saturday Night Fever. A tough look at young, working-class alienation and the weekly release that disco-going gave, to be made with an adult-skewed R rating. He asked Alan to work on the marketing. More unusually, he signed Travolta to $1 million 3-picture deal. First Fever, then Grease, then a romantic drama called Moment by Moment. Hollywood was aghast. Could a TV pin-up really lead 3 movies for such big bucks? It was early '77. De Niro had just wrapped on New York, New York with Martin Scorsese, having already wowed in Taxi Driver and The Godfather Part 2. Pacino was still basking in the success of Dog Day Afternoon. For John Travolta, it was finally time to show everyone what he was really worth. Within just over a year, of course, he was priceless. Fever and Grease had shown he could sing, he could dance, he could even get award nominations. Welcome Back, Kotter continued on the television too, now as much a show about Vinnie Barbarino as Gabe Kaplan's title character. Yet, as the decade came to a close, changes in Hollywood's output were clear. The brooding anti-heroics of A Clockwork Orange, Mean Streets and Serpico were losing out to the smilier fun and games of Star Wars, Superman and Smokey and the Bandit. Steven Spielberg's Jaws was at the centre of it all, released in the summer of '75 with unprecedented marketing, merchandising and screen count. Such saturation proved impossible to resist. Jaws became the first movie to hit $100 million in the United States. The new Hollywood generation that had relished the complexities of the Godfather saga now discovered something much simpler: man versus shark. It was a shift that made some sense. The constitutional crisis caused by Nixon's Watergate scandal was now a year old, and America's involvement in the Vietnam War had officially ended in April 1975. After years of serious, adult-oriented drama that had matched the weighty stories broadcast each day on the nightly news, audiences now not only wanted simpler fun, they needed it. Travolta, however, still needed credibility. "I want to show that I can do more than play safe, pretty boy roles," he always liked to remind journalists when he was starting out. The success of Fever and Grease had been immense in '78, but it had been a success that overwhelmed the original point of both their stories, gutsy adolescent angst. Disco tunes, sing-alongs, and John's pin-up status had smoothed out the movie's sharper edges, and while modern Hollywood audiences seemed to want more of that mainstream accessibility, the fun, Travolta the method actor had different ideas. How could he stay valuable in a Hollywood that now boasted a new currency? If only he could hold back the 80s a little longer. Still, if late 70s Travolta mania diluted much of his dangerous power, it shouldn't detract from the fact that Fever, before saturation turned it into a punchline, had plenty of genuine on offer. Travolta was determined and dedicated to De Niro levels of authenticity, filling his spare time learning to dance, 9 months training, he later claimed, helped by the snake-hipped choreographer Lester Wilson. For the ambitious actor, Tony Manero was the perfect chance to showcase his method, and he fought with director John Badham to get his dance scenes recut in order to spotlight all that he'd learned. I was crying and very angry because of the way the dance highlight was shot. I knew how it should appear on screen, and it wasn't shot that way. You couldn't even see my feet. After complaining to Stigwood, Travolta was allowed to recut the scene. Those millions who flocked to Fever during the early months of 78 might not have known about the passions that ran high behind the scenes, but they sure appreciated the end result. Nevertheless, if Fever's popularity threatened to overwhelm Travolta's intensity, then the shamelessly mainstream appeal of Grease, his second picture of the Stigwood deal, and Alan Carr's pet project, smothered it. It was midsummer 78, and the critics that had praised Fever just months earlier now complained that in the shiny Grease, Travolta's charisma had been seriously weakened, watered down from the Pacino-like swagger he'd shown playing Manero. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last of many accusations about a sea change in the industry, a new era of dumbing down. It's hard to argue. Compared to the blue-collar passion of Fever, compared even to the gritty Jacobs and Casey musical on which it was based, Grease the movie, with its deliberate family makeover, innuendo-laden but ultimately innocent, was always going to be a disappointment for the broadsheets. What had centred in its stage form on earthy memories of high school in Chicago had now been retooled by the colourful Alan Carr into a movie fairy tale, his own fantasy of what education was like in the late 50s rather than the reality. Barry Gibb's title song might have been sung by Frankie Valli, a former idol of the era, but its production was disco-tinged and slick, pure 1978. Insiders knew the deal. Making his new, poppier version of Grease, co-written with Bronte Woodard, had been a very personal dose of therapy for producer Carr rather than an attempt at realism. Like many kids, I was not too popular in high school, but producing Grease made me feel like I was president of my class. It was a movie I had to make, and it turned out to be as perfect a realization of my dream as I could hope for. Still, Grease was a huge hit. Its $159 box office million, nearly $40 million more even than Fever. Travolta's dominance seemed unstoppable. So it was perhaps inevitable that after Grease's success with younger teenagers, kids able to see it thanks to its family-friendly rating, Paramount looked again at Fever and made the obvious decision. Release a new PG cut of that movie too, aiming squarely at the same youthful Grease fans who weren't able to see John in R-rated disco mode the first time around. If the studio hadn't been entirely supportive of either film during production, the executives at Paramount weren't sure what they had, claims Grease director Randall Kleiser, they were sure as hell going to get their money's worth now they knew there was an appetite. This new Fever Light included 47 cuts, 43 audio changes, and 31 scenes with alternative, softer takes that Badham had shot in preparation for the film's eventual TV broadcast. Not that the director had found his actors, all with their De Niro aspirations, exactly eager to offer up gentler, more mainstream interpretations of their feisty Brooklynites. Initially, the cast refused to do it. "Oh, that's bullshit, man," I replied. "Have you guys ever heard of residuals? Every time this is shown on television, you guys will get paid." They were all brand new actors, so they had no idea. Suddenly, they were all very game. In some cases, the TV version is what went into the original because the actors were so much looser and more natural since they thought it was just a throwaway take. The disco focus of Fever was always the point, of course, a way for blue-collar immigrant kids to lose themselves for a few hours on the weekend. Yet this new PG cut only made it more so, gutting the dirty talk and angst to highlight the hit songs, the pop and sparkle of the music, way more digestible for young teens than R-rated bitterness and rape. Saturday Night Fever, then Grease, then a Fever re-release, plus, of course, disco. Endless disco. Mainstream media for the guy at the centre of them all, John Travolta, with his contrasting dream of credibility, meant all four were heading for overkill, scoring huge success while simultaneously signing their death warrants. Come the summer of '79, barely a year after Fever had soared, and concurrent with the rejigged PG cut of the film getting its first airing, because we want everyone to catch Saturday Night Fever, ran the new, more inclusive tagline, the infamous Disco Demolition Night took place in Chicago, rock fans snapping and burning disco vinyl, even rioting. It was an over-the-top and reactionary response for sure, but it was clear that the genre was being strangled by ubiquity. If it wasn't actually dead, then it was certainly a musical style in need of some medication. When, in 1980, Paramount reissued the recut Fever for a third time, this time in a blatant double bill with Grease, the industry's intentions for the new decade couldn't be any clearer. Forget serious grown-ups, get the teenage dollar fast, at whatever the cost. It didn't matter that Travolta might have wanted to move on from his teeny bopper status. The studio execs weren't ready to let him go. For Paramount, catching the disco wave just before it crashed had proven to be a vital reboot. As America's oldest-running studio, it had long stopped being considered youthful, but now boss Robert Evans, who'd overseen adult classics The Godfather and Chinatown during his tenure, was gone, and his replacement chairman, Barry Diller, had hired new execs, nicknamed the Killer Dillers, with more experience in television than in film. Paramount's owners, Gulf and Western, might have had the legendarily demanding Martin Davis at the helm, a bullish businessman who liked to breathe down his studio's neck, but with the no less high-flying Michael Eisner, Diller's former ABC colleague, as Paramount's president, the film company successfully reshaped itself to include more shorter, lighter product that didn't need a prestige movie brat director and that, crucially, would make money even if they didn't win awards. Here was the beginning of a new approach that would change 80s Hollywood forever. High-concept filmmaking, where a movie consisted merely of one simple idea which could be summed up as briefly as possible. Eisner, in particular, had that common touch, in tune with the middle-of-the-road tastes of everyday Americans. At ABC, he'd come up with the idea of Happy Days, a huge TV hit. He knew well that in the post-Jaws, Star Wars and Grease world of '78, 74% of the movie audience were aged between 12 and 29, and they were targeted ruthlessly. So, while Fever might have started out as much more than simply Travolta plus disco equals hit, that's how it ended up. It had high concept beaten into it. Perhaps the signs were even there from the early days. Fever's original director, John G. Avildsen, was considered a risk, and the suits at Paramount simply fired him. It didn't matter that he'd just been Oscar-nominated for directing Rocky. Late 1980. With the tweaked clean Fever now on cable TV, its origins as a sweary, misogynistic, true New York story were finally swept from people's minds as well as onto the cutting room floor. Kids at the start of the new decade considered Fever to be something very different. It didn't matter that its gutsy roots had always been clearly spelled out in Barry Gibb's downbeat lyrics, life going nowhere, somebody help me. It didn't matter that John Travolta's performance had been perhaps the decade's most charismatic and influential portrayal of adolescent frustration. Fever had been bleached clean for the young teen revolution, just as Grease had been by Carr. And now it was simply a fun film about disco dancing starring a pin-up in an ice-white suit. As Hollywood refigured its plans around him, Travolta also found the bright glare of limelight did him no favours. Questions about his private life refused to go away, fueled in part by the unconventional romance he'd just had with Diana Hyland, an actress 18 years his senior, with whom he'd worked on The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, and not helped by the campiness of romancing the openly lesbian Lily Tomlin in his third film of the 1978 Stigwood deal.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?